Racist cop assaults Black Navy SEAL in courtroom. He instantly regretted it when she fought back. What if the quiet of a courthouse could be broken by a single act of arrogance? A moment so small at first, yet destined to ripple far beyond those heavy wooden doors. Picture a sunlit courtroom on an ordinary Tuesday morning. The benches creaked as people settled in, the air faint with the scent of polished oak and old paper. Among them sat a woman in her late 30s, her posture steady, her expression calm. She wasn't there as a defendant or a bystander, but as someone with a story that few in the room knew, one marked by discipline, service, and sacrifice. Yet to one uniformed officer none of that mattered. All he saw was the color of her skin, and in that blindness he made a choice that would haunt him. Before we go further, where are you watching from today? The courthouse in the small city of Fairview had always felt like a place of order. For most people, it was simply a stop along the way to a quiet life, resolving property disputes, traffic tickets, or minor hearings that came and went with little attention. But on this particular Tuesday morning, that quiet order was tested. The woman, sitting quietly on the bench, was named Angela Carter, a 38-year-old former Navy SEAL who had returned to civilian life just a few years earlier. She carried herself with the same precision she'd once relied on during deployments overseas. Her shoulders were square, her gaze steady, and yet there was nothing intimidating about her demeanor. If anything, there was a quiet dignity about Angela, the kind that drew respect without demanding it. She wore a plain navy dress and carried a small black folder tucked neatly under her arm. She was there not for herself, but for her younger brother Marcus, who had been cited unfairly after a traffic stop that raised more questions than it answered. The officer who pulled him over claimed Marcus had been driving erratically, though no evidence supported the claim. Angela knew her brother, calm, patient, steady behind the wheel. The charge didn't add up. Marcus sat beside her, nervously tapping his foot against the wooden floor. "I don't like this," he whispered, leaning closer. "It feels like they've already made up their minds." Angela placed a steady hand over his. "That's why I'm here," she replied softly. "We tell the truth, we stand tall, and we let the process do its job. That's all we can do." At the far side of the courtroom stood Officer Randall Hayes, the man who had filed the charge. He was in his early 40s, his uniform pressed so sharply it almost gleamed beneath the fluorescent lights. Hayes had a reputation in Fairview, strict, uncompromising, and not always fair in how he applied his authority. Whispers in town suggested he held certain biases close to the surface, though no one had ever confronted him openly. As the judge entered, the room rose to its feet, the shuffle of movement echoing against the tall ceilings. Judge Whitmore was known for her stern but measured hand, and Angela felt a flicker of relief when she caught the woman's calm eyes scanning the room. At least someone here valued fairness. The proceedings began smoothly. Marcus's lawyer, a soft-spoken man named Thomas Riley, argued the lack of evidence clearly. The officer claimed Marcus had been weaving between lanes. Thomas countered that no dashcam footage existed. No witness accounts were offered, and Marcus's record was spotless. But the tension in the room wasn't just about Marcus. Angela noticed the way Officer Hayes kept stealing glances her way, his expression tight, his jaw flexing each time her gaze met his. At first she ignored it. She was used to scrutiny. Years in the military had taught her to hold herself steady, no matter who was watching. Still, something in his stare felt different. Not professional, not procedural, but personal. During a brief recess, as people stretched and shuffled papers, Hayes walked past where Angela and Marcus sat. He leaned slightly toward her, his voice low enough not to draw the judge's attention, but sharp enough for her to hear. "You don't belong here," he muttered, his eyes narrowing. "Court's no place for people like you." Angela's jaw tightened. She kept her voice even, almost quiet. "People like me? You mean citizens who care about the truth." Hayes gave a short, dismissive laugh and walked on, but the words lingered. Marcus turned to her, his eyes wide. "Did he just—" Angela held up a hand. "Stay calm. That's what he wants. Don't give him the satisfaction." The recess ended, and the hearing resumed. Yet the mood had shifted. It wasn't just about Marcus anymore. It was about something larger, something unspoken, that seemed to press against the air like a storm about to break. As Thomas continued his defense, Hayes was called to testify. He stood tall in the witness box, his hand raised for the oath. His testimony was rehearsed, clipped, and carefully worded. Yet as Angela listened, she caught inconsistencies, little gaps where the truth seemed stretched. She scribbled notes in her folder, ready to pass them to Thomas if needed. Then it happened. As Hayes described the supposed erratic driving, he glanced again toward Angela, and his tone sharpened. "I know what I saw," he declared. "These people—" He stopped short, as though realizing he'd revealed more than intended. A hush fell over the room. Judge Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "Officer Hayes, stick to the facts," she warned. Angela felt the heat of the moment press in. She caught Marcus's anxious look, and she placed her hand on his arm again. "We're okay," she whispered. But inside, she knew the situation was becoming dangerous. When prejudice crept into sworn testimony, justice itself trembled. After court adjourned for the day, Angela and Marcus stepped into the hallway, the cool air a relief after the tense proceedings. Yet before they could leave, Hayes appeared again, this time blocking their path. His voice was louder now, less restrained. "You think your little military record means anything here?" he sneered. "Not in my town." Angela straightened, her eyes steady on his. "Respect is earned by truth, officer, not by fear." The hallway went quiet as a few people turned to watch. Hayes's face flushed, his hand twitching near his belt, as though tempted to assert authority in the worst way. For a long moment no one moved. Angela's years of training kept her calm, her breathing slow, her gaze unyielding, and then, in a sudden, reckless motion, Hayes stepped too close, his shoulder brushing hers with deliberate force as he shoved past. It wasn't a full assault yet, but it was a line crossed in plain view. Gasps echoed through the hallway. Marcus stiffened, ready to react, but Angela held him back. "This isn't over," Hayes hissed under his breath, loud enough for all nearby to hear. Angela met his eyes, her voice low and firm. "No, it isn't. But the truth has a way of speaking louder than you ever could." That was the moment the courthouse and the people within it realized this was no longer an ordinary case. It was about more than one traffic ticket. It was about dignity, about justice, and about whether prejudice could stand unchallenged in a place meant to uphold the law. The stage was set, and the stakes had risen. The courthouse whispers didn't die down overnight. By the next morning, the hearing had become the talk of Fairview. Small towns had a way of magnifying everything, especially when it touched on questions of fairness and power. At the diner on Main Street, people debated over coffee. Some defended Officer Hayes as a long-standing member of the department. Others muttered about what they had seen in the hallway, wondering aloud if the rumors about his bias were finally showing their teeth. Angela knew the weight of small-town gossip. It wasn't idle chatter. It could tilt the balance of how a jury, a judge, or even an entire community perceived a case. When she walked back into the courthouse with Marcus that morning, she felt dozens of eyes on her. Some carried sympathy, others suspicion, but all carried expectation. Marcus leaned in as they passed through security. "Feels like we're walking into an ambush," he said softly. Angela gave him a steady look. "Let them look. The truth doesn't shrink under scrutiny." Still, she could feel her brother's unease. He had always been the quieter one, a schoolteacher who loved books and had never been one for confrontation. She admired his patience, but she also knew he was unprepared for the ugliness of prejudice when it took a public stage. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted. A few local reporters had taken seats in the back row, pens poised, waiting for the story to unfold. Judge Whitmore entered with her usual calm authority, but even she seemed more alert. As though she sensed the fragility of the balance in her courtroom, the defense continued its work, pointing out inconsistencies in Hayes's testimony. Each time Thomas, the lawyer, raised a question that exposed a gap, Hayes's answers grew shorter, tighter, more defensive. His jaw locked, and he glanced often toward Angela, as though she were the one undermining him, rather than his own words. It was during cross-examination that the first real crack split open. Thomas asked Hayes why there was no dashcam footage, no radio call, and no field sobriety test. Hayes shifted in his seat, cleared his throat, and replied, "My equipment wasn't working properly that night." The words hung in the air. Judge Whitmore raised an eyebrow. "Officer Hayes, are you stating that your patrol car was operating without a functioning dash cam?" Hayes hesitated. "It malfunctions sometimes," Thomas pressed. "Was it reported to your supervisor?" "Logged in maintenance, because those records would exist." The silence that followed was deafening. The judge scribbled a note. The reporters scribbled faster, and Angela, sitting just rows away, felt the tide begin to turn. But Hayes wasn't finished. Cornered, he lashed out in the only way he knew how, by attempting to discredit. "This whole challenge," he spat, "isn't about the stop. It's about people trying to make a name for themselves, trying to play the victim where none exists." He glanced directly at Angela as he said it. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Judge Whitmore's gavel struck the bench sharply. "Officer Hayes! This is not a stage for personal accusations. You will confine yourself to the facts." Yet the damage was done. Reporters exchanged knowing looks, and Angela felt her heart race. Not because she was afraid. She had faced far worse under far harsher conditions, but because she understood the weight of implication. Hayes had just tried to frame her and Marcus as opportunists, twisting reality to shield his own failing. At recess, Angela stepped outside for air. The autumn breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves and the distant sound of traffic. She leaned against the stone railing, eyes closed, centering herself. A memory flashed. Her Navy unit, huddled together after a mission, reminding each other that calm was their greatest weapon. She whispered the words her commander once told her, "Hold the line. Even when they push, hold the line." She opened her eyes to see a young reporter standing nearby, notebook in hand. "Miss Carter," he asked hesitantly, "is it true you served overseas?" Angela considered her answer carefully. "Yes, I served. But this isn't about me. It's about my brother and about fairness." "That's all?" The reporter nodded, jotting quickly before retreating. She knew the story would grow legs, no matter what she said. But at least she had spoken truth plainly. Back inside, the real twist emerged. During the afternoon session, Thomas produced a surprise piece of evidence, a witness statement from a retired postal worker who'd been driving behind Marcus that night. The man testified that Marcus's car had been steady, his speed normal, and that it was Hayes's cruiser that had swerved suddenly before pulling him over. The courtroom buzzed. Hayes's face darkened. He demanded to cross-examine, but his attempts only made him look flustered. The witness, calm and precise, described exactly what he saw, leaving little room for doubt. Marcus's hand trembled as he leaned toward Angela. "You think this will be enough?" Angela squeezed his hand gently. "It's more than enough. Truth has a way of finding daylight, but Hayes, humiliated and cornered, grew reckless. As the session ended and people filed out, he approached Angela directly in the crowded corridor. His voice was louder now, his words aimed not just at her, but at everyone within earshot. "You think you're some kind of hero," he sneered. "But you're nothing. Just another loudmouth trying to undermine real authority." Angela stood still, her gaze locked on his. "Respect is earned, officer, and you've just shown everyone how little you have." Something in Hayes snapped. With reporters nearby and onlookers watching, he shoved her shoulder hard enough to stagger her. The crowd gasped. A murmur rose. Angela steadied herself, her training kicking in. She didn't lash out, though every muscle in her body was capable of it. Instead, she raised her voice just enough to carry. "You just crossed a line in front of everyone here." The moment was electric. People whispered, some raised phones to record, and Judge Whitmore herself, stepping into the hallway at that instant, froze at the sight. "Officer Hayes!" she barked, her voice cutting through the chaos. "In my chambers! Now!" The hallway erupted with voices, but Angela remained calm, her breath steady, her eyes never leaving Hayes's as he was led away. For the first time, she saw something flicker in his gaze. Not dominance, not disdain, but fear. That was the crest, the moment when the tide had undeniably turned. Angela had not lifted a hand. She hadn't needed to. Her strength lay not in retaliation, but in composure, in the unshakable truth that justice was on her side, and Hayes, once untouchable, was now exposed under the very lights he thought would protect him. That night, Angela sat at her kitchen table, the glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the wood. Marcus was upstairs, finally asleep after hours of restless pacing. She stared at the black folder before her, its pages filled with notes, statements, and careful observations. On the surface, she looked calm, but inside, she felt the weight of something larger than her brother's case pressing down. She had faced enemy fire, navigated foreign terrain, and carried comrades to safety under impossible odds. Yet this battle, fought in suits and uniforms, with words instead of weapons, felt heavier in its own way. Because here, the enemy wasn't across an ocean. It was in her own town, wearing a badge, cloaked in authority. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from a fellow veteran, Claire, who had heard whispers about the case. "Stand firm," the text read. "You've carried heavier burdens before. Don't let this one break you." Angela smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes not from joy, but from the reminder that someone else sees your struggle. She set the phone down, inhaled deeply, and whispered to herself, "Hold the line." The following morning, the courthouse was busier than ever. Word had spread of the hallway incident, and this time more reporters filled the back rows. Community members who rarely attended court had come to see for themselves. There was tension in the air, yes, but also something else: expectation. Judge Whitmore began the session with an edge of steel in her voice. "This courtroom will not be reduced to theatrics or intimidation. We are here to seek truth, and truth alone." She cast a sharp glance at Hayes, who sat rigid, his face pale but defiant. Before testimony resumed, Whitmore addressed the shove witnessed the day before. "I have reviewed statements from multiple witnesses, and video evidence has been submitted by members of the public. Officer Hayes, your conduct will be referred to Internal Affairs for immediate investigation. Until further notice, you are to refrain from direct contact with the defendant, the defense witnesses, and their families outside this courtroom." The words hit like a gavel in themselves. Murmurs rippled through the room. For the first time, Hayes looked less like the enforcer and more like the accused. Angela felt a swell of relief, tempered with caution. Justice wasn't a single strike of lightning. It was a long storm that had to be weathered. Still, the acknowledgement mattered. It was proof that truth had found its first foothold, but the crisis wasn't over. Hayes' defense attorney fought back aggressively, trying to paint Angela's presence as interference. "She is not a party to this case," the attorney argued. "Yet she inserts herself at every turn, intimidating my client." Thomas, calm but firm, rose in response. "She is a sister supporting her brother. She has every right to attend proceedings, just like any citizen. And as for intimidation, it was Officer Hayes who crossed the line, not Ms. Carter." The judge's gavel cut through the heated exchange. "Enough. This court will not be a battlefield of personal attacks. We will proceed with the facts." Still, the smear attempt stung. Angela could feel the weight of eyes on her, questioning, measuring. For a moment, doubt crept in. Was her presence helping Marcus, or giving Hayes more fuel? That night, she walked alone by the river that cut through Fairview, the autumn air cool against her skin. She remembered nights overseas, when silence between missions felt heavier than the missions themselves. She remembered the faces of those she'd served with, the camaraderie, the unspoken promise that no one stood alone. And in that memory, she found her anchor. She wasn't standing in that courtroom for recognition. She was there because Marcus deserved the same fairness as anyone else, and because silence in the face of injustice had never been her way. The turning point came the next morning, when an unexpected ally stepped forward. Chief Ramirez, head of Fairview's police department, appeared in the courtroom. He was a man of measured words and deliberate actions, respected by many but often criticized for moving too slowly on matters of reform. As the hearing paused, he approached Angela quietly. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice low but clear, "I've reviewed what happened. Hayes's behavior is not what this department stands for. I can't undo the harm already done, but I want you to know this will be addressed." Angela studied him, searching his eyes for sincerity. She saw no political gloss, no empty assurance, only a man who, perhaps too late, had recognized the weight of his responsibility. "Thank you," she said simply. Back inside, Ramirez's presence was noted by everyone. For the first time, Hayes shifted uncomfortably, not because of Angela's steady gaze, but because his own superior was watching. The hearing pressed forward, and though Hayes continued to defend his version, the cracks grew wider. Each inconsistency became harder to explain, each counterpoint more damaging. The once unshakable officer was unraveling in plain sight. Angela sat with her brother, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "We're closer than you think," she whispered. Marcus exhaled, some of the tension easing from his shoulders. "I don't know how you stay so calm," he murmured. She smiled faintly. "Because losing our calm is what they count on, and we don't give them that." By afternoon, it was clear the case had shifted. The evidence wasn't just tilting in Marcus's favor, it was steadily exposing Hayes's misconduct. But beyond the legal battle, something deeper had begun. Members of the community, once silent, now watched with sharpened awareness. People who had brushed off rumors about Hayes were seeing the truth with their own eyes. The crisis had shown its teeth, but it had also lit a fire. Fairview was beginning to reckon with itself, and Angela, though weary, felt a quiet resolve settle in. She hadn't chosen this fight, but now that it was here, she would see it through. Not just for Marcus, but for anyone who had ever sat in a courtroom and felt unseen. The fifth day of the hearing dawned crisp and bright, the kind of morning that seemed almost too calm for what was about to unfold inside the courthouse. Angela arrived early, her folder tucked neatly under her arm, her steps steady as ever. Marcus walked beside her, shoulders tense but a little lighter now, as if each passing day had peeled away some of the fear. The courthouse lobby was crowded. More reporters had arrived, cameras hovering at the edge of the marble floor, waiting for the story's breaking point. Community members filled the benches, no longer idle spectators, but witnesses to a reckoning. Even those who had once defended Hayes now whispered uneasily among themselves. Inside, Judge Whitmore wasted no time. "This court will hear testimony from the Internal Affairs Review of Officer Hayes's conduct," she announced. "Proceed!" The room grew still as a representative from Internal Affairs, a composed woman named Inspector Dalton, stepped forward. She carried a slim binder and spoke in a voice that brooked no evasion. "Our preliminary investigation," Dalton began, "has found multiple discrepancies in Officer Hayes's reports. Patrol car maintenance logs contradict his testimony regarding malfunctioning equipment. Furthermore, video evidence from nearby traffic cameras on the night in question shows no erratic driving by Mr. Carter's vehicle." Gasps rippled across the courtroom. Angela felt Marcus's hand grip hers tightly. She returned the pressure, her eyes fixed ahead, unblinking. Dalton continued. Additionally, multiple witness statements, including that of a retired postal worker, align with Mr. Carter's account. Based on this evidence, we have reason to believe that the charge was unfounded and that Officer Hayes exercised poor judgment during the stop. The gavel struck once as Judge Whitmore called for order. Hayes shifted in his seat, his complexion pale, his jaw clenched. He looked less like an officer of the law and more like a man cornered by truth. Thomas, the defense attorney, rose calmly. "Your Honor, in light of this evidence, I move for immediate dismissal of charges against my client." The judge nodded slowly, her gaze sweeping the room. "Motion noted. I will review all findings before rendering a decision." In the meantime, Officer Hayes will remain under investigation for misconduct. The crowd buzzed again, reporters scribbling furiously. But beneath the stir of voices, Angela heard something else, a soft exhale from Marcus, almost a sigh of relief. "They're finally seeing it," he whispered. "Yes," Angela replied. "And once the truth shows itself, it doesn't go back into hiding." Yet even in this moment of progress, Hayes refused to concede. Rising suddenly, his voice cracked the air. "This is a witch hunt. I've served this community for years. You're going to throw it away because of one family's lies." The judge's gavel slammed again. "Sit down, Officer Hayes. Another outburst like that, and you'll be held in contempt." But Hayes wasn't just fighting the court. He was fighting the loss of the power he had long wielded unchecked. For Angela, his anger was no longer intimidating. It was revealing. It showed everyone exactly who he was when stripped of the uniform's shield. During the recess, Angela and Marcus stepped outside into the courthouse garden. Autumn leaves drifted down from the oaks, catching in the sunlight. Marcus leaned against the stone wall, his voice low. "I don't know what would have happened if you weren't here." Angela turned to him, her expression softening. "You would have stood tall. You've got more strength than you think. I just reminded you of it." He shook his head. "No, Angie, you carried me through this. Just like you carried your team overseas." Her throat tightened, but she only smiled. "Family carries each other. That's how we win." When court resumed, the climax came in full. Judge Whitmore, after reviewing the evidence and testimony, ruled that all charges against Marcus were dismissed. The gavel struck final and resolute. "Mr. Carter, you are free to go." Relief washed over Marcus's face. Tears glimmered in his eyes as he clasped Angela's hand, whispering, "It's over." But Angela knew it wasn't truly over. Not yet. Justice for Marcus was secured, but accountability for Hayes still lay ahead. Before adjourning, Judge Whitmore addressed the courtroom. "This case has revealed troubling conduct unbecoming of law enforcement. It is the duty of this court and this community to ensure fairness applies equally to all. Let this be a reminder. Authority is not a license for bias, but a responsibility to protect with integrity." The words settled heavily, but also with hope. Reporters nodded, scribbling as though capturing not just a verdict, but a turning point. Hayes sat silent, seething. His career hung by a thread, his reputation unraveling. He had underestimated the quiet strength of a woman who had fought battles far tougher than his prejudice. And now, before the eyes of the very community he thought would always shield him, he was exposed. As the courtroom emptied, Angela paused by the door. She glanced back at Hayes one final time, not with anger, but with calm resolve. She didn't need revenge. Justice was already unfolding. Outside, the autumn air was crisp, carrying with it the sound of people talking, reporters calling questions, and neighbors greeting Marcus with handshakes and quiet words of support. One reporter asked Angela directly, "Miss Carter, do you have any comment on the outcome?" Angela smiled gently, shaking her head. "Justice spoke for itself today." "That's enough," she turned, placing a steady hand on Marcus's shoulder as they walked down the courthouse steps together. For the first time in days, Angela allowed herself a deep breath of release. The battle for Marcus was won. The larger fight for fairness, for dignity, was just beginning. But she knew one truth above all. Once justice found its voice, it could never be silenced again. The courthouse steps were nearly empty by late afternoon. The reporters had filed their stories, neighbors had drifted back to their lives, and the heavy doors closed with a solemn thud behind them. Angela stood for a long moment at the bottom of the stairs, her brother beside her, the autumn breeze tugging gently at her hair. Marcus exhaled slowly, as though releasing the last of his fear. "I still can't believe it," he murmured. I thought they'd never listen." Angela squeezed his shoulder. "They listened because the truth demanded it. Not because of who we are, but because of what's right." He looked at her, his expression soft. "You've always believed that." "Even when I doubted," she smiled faintly. "That's what family's for. To remind us who we are when the world tries to tell us otherwise." As they walked toward the parking lot, the sun dipped lower, painting the courthouse in golden light. It struck Angela that buildings themselves carry memory. The walls now held echoes of every word spoken, every truth revealed, every injustice confronted. Fairview's courthouse would never be quite the same. Over the next week, the ripple spread. Hayes was placed on administrative leave, pending full review by Internal Affairs. The local paper ran a front-page editorial on accountability, acknowledging the bravery of ordinary citizens like Marcus who dared to challenge authority. Neighbors who had once whispered in corners now spoke openly, some admitting they had seen or felt bias before, but had been too afraid to call it out. Angela received quiet messages from people she barely knew. A mother who said her teenage son had been stopped unfairly but never reported it. An older man who remembered his father's warnings about staying out of trouble because of the color of his skin. They thanked her not for fighting, but for holding steady, for showing that calm truth could stand taller than arrogance. In the evenings, Angela sat on her porch with Marcus, watching the river glint in the fading light. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke, a comfort against the memory of tense days inside the courthouse. One evening, Marcus placed a small photo frame on the table between them. It was a picture of their late father, smiling, his arm around both of them, at a family barbecue years ago. "He would have been proud," Marcus said quietly. Angela's throat tightened. "He taught us to stand tall even when it wasn't easy." Marcus nodded, his eyes glistening. "And you did that for me." The symbolic weight of that photo struck Angela deeply. Their father's lessons about dignity, fairness, and courage had carried her through battlefields overseas and through this quieter but equally demanding fight at home. The photo wasn't just memory. It was a reminder that justice wasn't a gift handed down, but a responsibility carried forward. Weeks later, the final report came. Hayes was found guilty of misconduct, stripped of his badge, and barred from serving in law enforcement again. The ruling was measured, procedural, and free of spectacle. Yet its impact was profound. For the first time in years, Fairview saw accountability not as a dream, but as reality. Angela received no awards, no formal recognition. She didn't want them. What mattered was that Marcus's name was cleared, and the truth was preserved. On a quiet Sunday morning, she visited her father's grave. The cemetery was still, the air crisp. She placed the photo frame against the headstone, her fingers brushing the cool stone. "Dad," she whispered, "we held the line. Just like you taught us." The wind stirred gently, rustling the leaves above. She stood there for a long time, her heart both heavy and light, knowing the fight had cost her peace, but given her brother his dignity back. And in that there was victory. As she turned to leave, her phone buzzed. A message from Claire, her fellow veteran. "Saw the news. Proud of you. Proud of what you stood for." "Coffee soon?" Angela smiled, sliding the phone into her pocket. Life was returning to its quiet rhythms. The battles weren't over, not in Fairview, not anywhere. But she knew now more than ever that even one voice, steady and unshaken, could bend the arc toward justice. That evening, as the sun sank over the river, Angela sat on her porch again, Marcus beside her. The photo of their father rested between them, catching the last light. They didn't need words. The silence was full of memory, of relief, of quiet triumph. After a while, Angela turned to her brother. "You know," she said softly, "this wasn't about fighting back. It was about standing firm. That's where real strength lives." Marcus nodded slowly, his gaze on the fading horizon. "And you taught me that." The world seemed to exhale with them, the river carrying its steady song through the night. For those who had watched from afar, for those who had followed their story, there was a lesson to carry. Justice is not loud, not flashy, not swift. It is steady. It requires patience, courage, and the willingness to stand when others falter. Angela had shown that, not with fists or fury, but with the unyielding weight of truth. And in doing so, she reminded the town, and perhaps anyone listening, that dignity always has the last word. So if you've been touched by this journey, if it stirred something in your own memories of standing firm when it mattered, I'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments, because these stories aren't just mine or Marcus's, they belong to all of us who believe in fairness. And if you want more stories like this, filled with heart, justice and hope, please subscribe and stay with us. Thank you for walking this path with Angela, with Marcus and with me. May we all remember to hold the line.